Good. I'm Yvette Moy, and I'm the University of Washington's Director of Public Lectures, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's lecture with John Wood Jr. Tonight, he is the National Ambassador to the organization Braver Angels, the former second vice chairman of the Los Angeles Republican Party, as well as a writer. And he is going to be talking tonight about philosophical nonviolence and the democratic ideal. And we here in the Office of Public Lectures in the university feel like it's a pretty important topic. As a public university, we hear a lot about how we don't share conservative perspectives, and we're hoping that by tonight we can start to change that narrative a little bit. And we also want to remind you to come back on the 25th of February for George Conway III, who will be lecturing as well. But he's no longer a Republican, so we tried. Before I share information about John, I want to go over a couple housekeeping items with you guys. If you haven't done so already, could you please silence your cell phones? We ask that you refrain from video or audio recording this evening's lecture. We are live streaming tonight's lecture, and you can find it on the Office of Public Lectures YouTube channel. We also ask that you please refrain from taking photographs while John is on stage. We do have our reporter here tonight from the UW Daily who will be taking photos for the first 5 minutes while John is on stage. So if you hear a clicker, the shutter, just don't worry, it's temporary and it's to help students. So we figure that's a good thing. There are two ways that you can ask questions this evening. The first one is you can send a question in via Slido. There should be a QR code that's going to pop up in a minute. And you also received it in your registration reminder. You can also upvote audience questions as well. We also invite you to come to the microphone, which is to stage right. And the only request that we have is that if you choose to do that, that you please ask your question in the form of a question. So, no one's surprised. And then I'd like to share a little background information on tonight's speaker. John Wood Jr. is a leading voice in the American depolarization movement. As National Ambassador for Braver Angels, the nation's largest bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to political reconciliation, he works to bridge ideological divides and foster dialogue. A nationally recognized speaker on political and racial reconciliation, John has addressed audiences across the country, including top think tanks, universities, corporations, philanthropic organizations, and political associations such as the Aspen Institute, the Manhattan Institute, CPAC, Global Philanthropy Forum, and the Philanthropy Roundtable. His campus engagements have included Pepperdine, Duke, USC, Purdue, and UC Berkeley. His writing has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Examiner, to name a few. He also hosts a radio show called The Reconstruction Project on KBLA. Prior to his work with Braver Angels, John made history as California's youngest active congressional nominee in the 2014 election, challenging Representative Maxine Waters in the 43rd District. His campaign focused on unity and garnered media attention from the National Review and the Larry Elder Show. After the election, he was elected second vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles, the largest county-level GOP organization in the entire nation. And beyond Braver Angels, Wood advises several initiatives, including the American Project, which is the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism and the 1776 Unites Project. He is a member of the Progress Network, which is an initiative of the New American Foundation, and a field builder with the New Pluralist Collaborative, which supports organizations committed to depolarization and social justice. John has also worked extensively to expand educational opportunities for at-risk youth in Los Angeles, serving on the board of Strive Arts and Academics. I'd like you to put your hands together to welcome this evening's guest, John Wood Jr., and as he's making his way to the stage, if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself to the people around you and make a friend tonight. Thanks.
Whew. I suppose I should give folks a second to mingle. So it reminds me of church a little bit. It's like, say hello to your neighbor. Hi, neighbor, how you doing? Well, I just really want to express and sound a note of gratitude for everybody who came out tonight. It's wonderful to be in Seattle. I've got friends all over the country, and I hear people talking about Minnesota nice a lot, but I feel like there's a thing called Seattle nice, some of the nicest people I know. are in Seattle, and Yvette is now on that list. And that does, I think, give me an opportunity to sort of angle my way into the spirit of my talk this evening, because human kindness is something that's very easy to take for granted, and it's something that we tend not to expect very much out of our political discourse, out of our political culture these days. But kindness, and even a level deeper than kindness, something more on the order of compassion, goodwill, and love, I argue and believe very fervently, is actually the substantive value and virtue and animating force of human action, which will ultimately prove to be the pathway to the salvation of American democracy. Thank you. Really and truly, the fundamental things that we learned in kindergarten and then maybe forgot in college are the things that we need to remember today. So before I go into that too deeply, I will talk a little bit about myself, just by way of framing my experience a little bit. I note that my sort of political experience and partisan affiliation is perhaps a subject of some interest. It's true, I ran for Congress way back in the 2014 cycle, as was mentioned, and it was something that I did without any hope of success by any conventional expectations, and yet I threw myself into that campaign in a deeply committed sort of way because I had a reason for running and something that I wanted to express, win or lose. Now, I didn't have any money, I didn't have any reputation or resume to speak of. I could give a pretty good speech, and I knew the issues fairly well. So, having been born and raised in Los Angeles, and running in a district in LA that was primarily black and brown, but that had pockets of conservatives, Republicans in some of the South Bay parts of LA County. People would ask me whether I was speaking at a black or Democratic-leaning church in South Central LA or Watts, or to a white Tea Party club, let's say, in Torrance or Lomita. People would say, what at the age of 26 makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complicated as the California 43rd? And I'd say, well, I have an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you. And so, right? And that tended to be sort of the way I would frame, who I was and what my campaign was about. I'd actually grown up as a liberal activist. So I was a liberal activist in high school. I gave my first speech opposing the Iraq War at the Culver City City Council meeting, where we passed a resolution opposing that conflict, a speech I would still probably be comfortable giving today, and experienced a shift in the trajectory of my own sort of philosophy and worldview in certain respects. Now, I worked very hard for the campaign of Barack Obama in 2008. I saw a lot of my own experience in Obama's campaign. This overarching message of hope and change that seemed to add up to a vision of a post-partisan, post-racial America. And beyond the biographical points of connection that I had with then Senator Obama, I felt a deep resonance in the core of his message with the larger vision of the promised land that was articulated by Dr. King in the midst of the civil rights movement, this idea of a beloved community, of meaningful and deep human connection and human inclusion within the framework of an equitable democracy, but one that would require us to make common cause ultimately and speak to the conscience and dignify people who were different from us, who looked different from us, and who also thought differently than we did in the context of politics and society. And so in an effort to bring people into the Obama movement, as I sort of related to it, I took it upon myself, though I had grown up in a family that had Republicans and so forth, I took it upon myself to really start deeply digging into conservative philosophy, understanding conservative politics and points of view. And so I started reading books I'd never read before. I read Atlas Shrugged and Wealth of Nations and so forth. Concurrently, I was in the midst of something of a kind of a journey into engaging Christianity. It's sort of a parallel track in my development, but it happened at the same time to similar effect. And I started studying African American history from a more conservative vantage point. And I looked up one day and I just realized, I said, I really don't like the way a lot of conservative pundits talk. I don't like the way politics is done on Fox News and talk radio. And, I could say something similar in other directions, but I just sort of looked up and, at this point in my life, I was married. I was sort of finding religion. I had moved from Los Angeles to a military town. My wife was in the Army. A lot of parts of my development started to veer in a more sort of conservative direction. So I just looked up one day and I realized, I was like, if I make a list of 100 issues, I'm sort of right of center on like 62 or 65 of them. And I had this very uncomfortable sort of personal realization, like, damn it, I'm a Republican. And so, but the thing that had not changed about me was this belief in the beloved community, this belief that ultimately, yes, politics is about agreeing and even more to the point, disagreeing about important matters that we nevertheless have to work together on as neighbors and as members of a community to be able to effectuate reasonable solutions and compromises to. But that can only happen if there's a spirit of really mutual goodwill that exists in society across those boundary lines. And I was somebody who was fed up with the stereotypes of our politics. I didn't like the way I heard sort of right-wing pundits characterizing people who were concerned about racial justice and equity in our society, because I felt that there were valid reasons for those concerns. And I didn't like hearing left-wing pundits sort of painting with a broad brush and suggesting that conservatives and white men in America, like my father, were sort of by and large racist on account of whatever their cultural upbringing may have been. Human reality to me was much more complicated than that. And even if some of these things could be said to be true, it still doesn't nullify our obligation to engage one another in a manner that dignifies our mutual humanity. And so in short, I decided that just to be a voice for that kind of politics at a moment in time that, it's quaint by comparison to where we're at now, but felt pretty divided back then with Barack Obama in office, the Tea Party rising up, and a conflictual moment, I decided to sort of blow everybody's minds, and I ran for Congress as a Hope and Change Republican. And so that was sort of the spirit of the campaign that I ran in 2014. Look at some of y'all just still laughing. It's like, wait a second, let me do the math on that. Oh, does that add up? Yeah, I was the one. I was the one. Now, after that, I found my way to a larger community of Americans and many different organizations who were working on the project of bridging our political and our cultural divides outright. And it was in that capacity that I eventually made my way to an organization then originally called Better Angels, invoking the spirit of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, where he makes reference to the better angels of our nature, right? We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of our affection. And he goes on to say that the chorus of the union will again swell when touched, as surely it will be, by the better angels of our nature. Well, there was an organization by that name that was holding community-level gatherings rooted in principles of family therapy, basically doing marriage counseling for Republicans and Democrats. And I found that organization in the fall of 2017, fell in love with the work that they were doing, sort of hitched my wagon to that enterprise, and have been honored to play a small part in the growth of it over years into the largest grassroots organization focused on the work of political depolarization in America. And I'm very honored today because several of my colleagues showed up to support and to hear this talk, and I just want to give you all a round of applause because you are on the front lines of the work of helping us to live up to the better angels of our nature. And so it's an honor to be able to work day by day with people who care about the humanity of people who our political environment writ large likes to say have no humanity to care about. And so that brings me to the main point of the evening. I grew up with a deep and hallowed belief in the sanctity, if you will, of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And it's an interesting thing because there's nothing saying that you are going to be born into life in a community and in a nation that in its recent history experienced something of a moral revolution that you yourself can tie the very fact of your existence to in some way. And the way that I was able to sort of tie the fact of my existence to the cultural impact of Dr. King and the larger civil rights and nonviolent movement at which he stood at the helm. As mentioned before, I'm the product of biracial relationship, to use the term, a multicultural home. And the grandson of white Southerners who, by the context of their time, I think it would be fair to say were forward-looking and had a love for people in general, but they didn't necessarily feel an enthusiastic embrace of the idea of interracial marriage, right? This was a little situation in my family, when my parents wed. But by the time I was old enough to have a conscious relationship with them, they loved me and my brother more than anything in this world. And they mirrored a shift that took place, not universally, but substantially enough in the cultural quarters of American society, in the American South, and across a wide spectrum of American life beyond that, in which the American people, long divided by the fault lines of race, began to consciously embrace a project of integration that made it possible for me to grow up, the black grandson of white Southern grandparents, in a progressive community in the form of Culver City in Los Angeles that really embraced the multifaceted nature of my identity. And so I tell people I grew up in King's promised land in that way. I grew up in King's beloved community. I grew up thinking that that was the default fact of life in America. And it took me a while to realize that the substance of that reality hadn't necessarily migrated to every facet of our national experiment. But at the same time, the progress that emerged from that period of time was real, not just in terms of the gains and changes that took place in the legal regime of American government as affected the problems of equal access to education, literal segregation of public facilities and private facilities, Jim Crow segregation, housing discrimination, so on and so forth, but as affected the cultural transformation of our attitudes towards each other. Took a while to catch up to my understanding, the fact that the ethos of Dr. King was something that had an impact that was perhaps not necessarily complete in the conscience of American society, but nevertheless needed to be conserved and built upon in the present day. And so, as I got older and realized that the idea that democracy works according to the health of the relationships that we have with each other, and that those relationships have to be rooted in deeper soil than mere tolerance of one another's existence, it came to be clear to me over time that the actual substance of Dr. King as a philosopher and not just the political victories of Dr. King as a civil rights leader, needed to be revived in our cultural memory in order for us to paint a picture of what American society could look like if she were to meaningfully reacquaint herself with the better angels of her nature. And so what it occurs to me now to articulate is this fact that we were only able to cross a divide in American society at that period of time that existed not just on the level of political disagreements, but on the level of identity and deep-seated tribal animosity that goes all the way back to the founding injustices of American society. We were only able to cross that divide through the power of love. And indeed, the philosophy of nonviolence is a philosophy of love applied to the question of democracy and social action. And so the question becomes, what does that look like, and how do we understand that? Philosophical nonviolence is rooted in the idea of agape love. And Dr. King was frequent in saying that when he refers to love, he refers not to mere sentiment, not to emotional bosh, if you will, but rather to an overarching goodwill that recognizes the dignity and humanity of your neighbor and of your opponent. Something that allows you, through the indwelling goodwill that you feel towards people who may not feel that goodwill towards you, to express to them, to convey to them the fact that you mean them well even as you challenge the things that they say and believe in the name of truth and in progress, right? The power of agape, the power of goodwill, the power of love is such that it maximizes your ability to speak to the conscience of those who disagree with you while releasing yourself from the albatross of fear, of contempt, of anxiety, of judgment. It frees you from the burden of these things so that you may be able to speak in a way that shows the person whom you are challenging that you are opponents on the level of politics, but you are not enemies on the level of our shared humanity. And so Dr. King, in explaining the ethos of the student protesters, the attitudes that were disciplined and cultivated before young men and women would go into segregated lunch counters in the South and subject themselves to harassment, to abuse, was a discipline in which prior to engaging in any of those acts of civil disobedience, they would say to themselves over and over, if I am hit, I will not strike back. If I am cursed, I will not curse in return. And yet, nonviolence is not passive. It is aggressive in the form of persuasion. It is aggressive in the form of moral appeal. It is a heavy burden because it invites upon yourself a willingness to endure the aggression and the hurt that people will set upon you in the context of our political and social classes, and yet that unearned suffering, in King's words, is redemptive. Because by absorbing that contempt from other people and not returning contempt as the price for that, as the purchase price for that, you are able to clear away the dry tinder upon which contempt burns over time, thus breaking the cycle by which we find ourselves locked in perilous combat with each other in a way that sets us on a path that is a society in which the ultimate outcome of democracy, whether we have the left or the right in power, might ultimately be one in which we are wrestling with each other over the question of who gets to look out and command the heights of a hill of ashes. A Pyrrhic victory that none of us want to see. Now, Dr. King's time, in the context of the civil rights movement, was of course distinct in many respects from the context of the movement, of the moment we are living in now. And that's not to say that the work of social justice is antiquated or obsolete by any stretch of the imagination. It is just to say that we've moved into a different phase of that historic quest in the overall political landscape, to say nothing of the cultural and certainly the technological landscape of American society has shifted, right? So while there is still, of course, a role for protest and demonstration and for nonviolence to inform a culture of activism, it is important by my lights to highlight the fact that the philosophical basis of nonviolent activism also applies to the culture of discourse that exists in American democracy writ large. In other words, the idea that we should not curse one another, but not only should we refrain from cursing one another, but we should refrain and discipline within ourselves a charitable attitude towards how we feel about one another, to serve as the inward dwelling psychological, spiritual, and emotional foundation from which we speak. That applies universally as something that is needed in a politics that is in desperate requirement of some healing these days, but that has no well to drink from in terms of being able to realize it, because we have long since forgotten in our mainstream consciousness what it looks and feels like to be able to summon an inner idea of virtue and wed it to the way in which we actually practice dialogue, to the way in which we actually practice debate and discourse, and even the rough and tumble work of political competition. So I'm trying to get us to remember. And really, in a meaningful way, this is what many folks in the larger universe of bridge builders in American society are trying to get us to remember. Dr. King said that we do not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent. We do not seek to humiliate or defeat the white man, but to win his friendship and his understanding so that we may be reconciled to one another in the beloved community. Now, if you look at the lineage of nonviolence as a philosophy, it has many roots. Dr. King is by no means the end-all, be-all of that philosophical tradition. And of course, you all will know that in addition to the gospel and the very example of Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross and his teachings and the Beatitudes, King's primary inspiration, substantively speaking, for the practice of nonviolence comes from Mahatma Gandhi, who, of course, led the Indian independence movement successfully through the vehicle of nonviolence and experienced extraordinary brutality in that effort, and yet returned love for hate and peace for violence. But in the conception of nonviolence that Gandhi cultivated, that King himself adopted, there were different applications of nonviolence that would situate it in a more contextual sort of manner. There was an activist mode of nonviolence, which was about directly challenging power, speaking truth to power, but wielding moral and spiritual force in the effort to change hearts and minds when confronted with superior arms. And so you see that playing out in the Indian independence movement. You see that playing out in the American civil rights movement. But then there is satyagraha, this idea of sort of a constructive nonviolence, if you will, which in fact was the nonviolence of community building. And so after the success of the Indian independence movement, one of the areas in which Gandhi turned his focus was to the polarized relationship that existed between Hindus and Muslims. And in that context, Gandhi counseled and taught Hindus in their relationships with their Muslim brothers and sisters that when they bow to you, you bow lower to them. You ignite a culture of reciprocity in which the tension and the competition between us becomes one of who can serve each other the most, one in which we are willing to go first in showing and modeling humility and deference. And in this way, creating the space for us to build community across polarized religious divides. When you understand this as a progression, you can see the arc of connection that exists between the activism of Dr. King, one in which the successful challenge of power in the name of love and moral righteousness and equality and dignity and justice leads in a stream to the ocean of community, beloved community, a community in which we are seen, honored for our humanity, and have the equal prospects for democratic participation and access to the resources of society in ways that are ensured not merely on the basis of legal guarantees, but more fundamentally on the basis of the fact that there is a human connection that ripples out across the fabric of the republic, across the fabric of a political society, whereby we are invested in the project of self-government through a deep goodwill for our neighbor that ensures our commitment to our mutual human flourishing. That was Dr. King's ultimate goal. And so it became a difference between desegregation and integration. Dr. King would talk about desegregation, and he would say this is necessary. And what desegregation is a rolling back of the legal status quo of the laws that prevented black people and white people and people of color, more generally speaking, to be able to access and occupy equitably the public and oftentimes private spaces of American life. It was a matter of law. But integration is something deeper than that. Integration is an earnest and sincere embrace and acceptance of your neighbor. And so in Dr. King's terminology, it is the difference between being elbow to elbow versus being heart to heart. I think that these days, a lot of us are just trying to survive our politics today. We get whipped around by the headlines, by developments that seem so wild and so extreme and so extraordinary, and yet get to be so hard to keep up with that there's a way in which we are just on this roller coaster waiting for it to stop. And people feel that way on the left and on the right and everywhere in between, right? And so when you're in the midst of a fight or flight sort of moment, when the adrenaline is rushing, when you're just trying to get through the next moment, it could be hard to situate yourself towards a goal that seeks to realize something that is not just making its way through the present peril, but that actually seeks to realize the greatest possible society that we are capable of. A society in which we genuinely and meaningfully belong to one another across the divides of politics and culture, even cultural identity. And yet, such a society is possible to progress towards. I'm not Pollyannish in the sense that I believe in a 100% solution to society's problems at any fixed point in time. To live in the real world is to reckon with the fact that there is always an element of tragedy and sorrow and injustice to be contended with. And depending on your metaphysical point of view, you might believe that the reason we exist is to challenge the very injustice that accompanies us in reality, to constantly move us towards a promised land that maybe you never fully reach in your lifetime, or maybe isn't fully available to everybody in the amount of time that you have to live. Indeed, Dr. King himself said, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will reach that promised land, just as Moses effectively said to the people of God as they left the land of Egypt in the scriptures. But the promise of that possibility is something that can sustain us in the love that we feel for one another and in the faith that we have in the future. Dr. King said that the nonviolent movement, the students who led that movement, and of course it was people of all ages, but he said that they had a faith in the future and a belief in the redemptive capacity for goodness that existed in the heart of every racist white Southerner and every human being besides. That there was goodness to be spoken to in the human heart across the spectrum, if we were willing to summon the goodwill from within ourselves to do so. Now, inevitably, it is no easy or simple thing to just advise somebody to pick up the cross and to sling it on your back and to walk up the hill. And that was certainly the case for Dr. King, for Septima Clark, for Ella Baker, for John Lewis, for Rabbi Herschel, and for those who took up that cause in that period of time. I do think it's fair to say that if people could sacrifice their bodies day in and day out and humble themselves sufficient to be able to love those who hated them in the context of a struggle like that, that we can perhaps endure the trial of speaking lovingly to our MAGA uncle or to our woke niece at Thanksgiving dinner. That's something we can find a way to do. I think that we can summon within ourselves a standard for the righteous conduct of our politics, that we are willing to hold our elected officials accountable to, as well as our pundits and our opinion makers across the political spectrum. I think we have it within us in reacquainting ourselves with the better angels of our nature to labor diligently for a culture in American democratic society day in and day out that expresses itself on college campuses, in corporations, in community block clubs, in PTAs, and in church pews, and at kitchen tables, which says that our disagreements are inevitable, the conflicts between our interests real, and yet we still have an obligation to love one another as ourselves, as the Golden Rule asks us to do, and to act on that, to not just believe in it as an abstraction, but to look for ways in which that moral calling can express itself in the way we treat each other. And if we are able to marshal that spirit, if we are able to marshal those sentiments, then what we will find is that over time, we will come to understand one another much better tomorrow than we do today. We will be able to speak with credibility towards one another in a way that builds trust. Because ultimately, it is not disagreement that prevents us from being able to make progress in our politics. It is a lack of trust that stands in the way of our being able to solve the great problems of our time. Because if I think that you are wrong, but I know that you mean well, and I know, therefore, that you are willing to work with me towards a good outcome, I can humbly accept the fact that a particular political question does not go my way. Just as in a marriage, if I don't get the first pick on where we eat for dinner, I'm not going to fight it too much because I know that we're going to go somewhere next time that I'm going to enjoy, that we're going to make choices that take each of our preferences into account. And if we do come to an impasse that is deep and bitter, we can still love each other through the struggle, because love itself is a struggle. But the absence of love is not a struggle, it is a capitulation. It is a slow-moving acceptance of a spiral into the abyss. And that's what threatens American society. A spiral into the abyss of contempt and an absence of trust, which puts us in a position where we wind up believing information that is fed to us, not on the basis of any objective merits or evaluation of facts, but more on the basis of the tribal allegiance that we share or do not share with this pundit or that politician, bifurcating us into different informational universes. But that separation is something that only follows the separation in the fabric of goodwill in our society that keeps us from being able to stay in relationship with one another. And so that's where the true battlefield is. It is that battlefield that slices a line down the middle of every human heart. That choice over whether or not to give up on our neighbor and to cast out any sense of their human dignity, or to speak to that human dignity because we remember that at the end of the day, there's a person with a capacity for goodness in that individual who disagrees with us, whose politics may even be a threat to us, but that capacity for goodness is still worth believing in and still worth making the effort to speak to and to live your life in a way that commits you to the utmost of your ability to try and live up to that standard yourself so that you can clear the path for others to follow. Breaking the cycle of hatred in American society is a democratic project. It is the ultimate democratic project. And ultimately, there is no issue you can name, whether it be immigration or climate change or anything that you can survey in the vast landscape of foreign affairs or domestic concerns like healthcare and poverty, that does not ultimately resolve to this question, the question of whether or not we are willing to live with one another, to embrace one another as neighbors and friends, or to the very least aspire towards that goal. Remembering, of course, that does not mean that we do not speak truth to power or to our neighbors. What it means is that we speak truth to power and to our neighbors in a righteous spirit of love. And so, in closing, I would like to root this idea of agape love in a perennial resource of hope. Because hope can feel so quaint, it can feel so outdated. And we can feel so overwhelmed by the mass of hatred and corruption and negativity that we are buried with on a daily basis. And so we look for smarter and smarter solutions. We look for advertising and marketing tactics to run successful campaigns. We look for technologies that can allow us to end-run the stagnation of our government. We look for all of these things to try and fight our way out of the muck of a dysfunctional system. But truth be told, the resources for overcoming the malaise of our society and the corruption of our politics are ultimately found in the reservoir of the human soul, in the deep well of your conscience. As a people, we can reacquaint ourselves with this power, with the better angels of our nature, and we can believe in our ability to strive towards the beloved community once more. And with that, I close. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, John. For those of you who are in the audience with us tonight and have questions, please queue up. We have a couple questions that have come through on Slido, and I can kick us off while everybody kind of gets grounded. All right, so first question. You've spent years engaging people across deep divides. What has surprised you most about what actually softens people as opposed to what we assume should?
Well, truth be told, if you situate the context of the engagement in the right way, the very act of making eye contact with somebody from a different point of view and speaking in tones that are striving towards something that is hospitable and conciliatory, you can see people's body language begin to shift just when they hear the other person starting to speak, and they're able to read in their eyes that they're not there to attack them, right? I remember a friend of mine who was very successful, very educated, progressive individual. In the aftermath of observing a Braver Angels workshop, say to me that his entire emotional disposition towards the pro-life movement changed. Not because he suddenly was pro-life himself, he was not. But in the midst of that encounter, he saw a pro-life man break down and weep over the pain he felt at the loss of unborn babies. And what this progressive individual said to me was that he said, I never thought that they meant it. He said, I always thought that that was just a way of disguising a desire to decide what women do with their bodies and to morally shame the rest of us. He said, that's the first time I realized that this is actually a sincere feeling that people have, right? See, the thing is that segregation and separation has always been a problem in American life. The great Monica Guzman is here, and I'm going to mangle a great quote of hers. But Monica, of course, has said that people who are underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination. And this is true. And that problem has been greatly exacerbated by social media, because when we interact in social media, we are abstracting and reducing ourselves to mere text, mere images, right? Having conversations that don't exist in real time, where we aren't able to physically and directly sort of signal through body language, through tone, the elements that telegraph our human emotions as being like your human emotions. And so the very act of sharing a space in the right setting can begin to bring people together, and witnessing the sincerity of people's points of view can have a way of humanizing us to one another, right? So note, there's a difference between agreement and humanizing. But humanizing the other person is the start of the pathway that can begin to build towards trust, relationship, and goodwill. From there, we can begin to move towards material progress. And so, yeah, that's something that occurs to me in response to that question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I find that righteous anger is so seductive and really stops curiosity in that agape. What's a good way to be with righteous anger one's own and people we're talking to?
Right. Well, I think that righteous anger is important. And Dr. King believed that as well. It's just that we have to direct our righteous anger towards forces that do not reduce the reality of the evil that we face in the world to the people who themselves are victims of it because they are afflicted by it. So that was the attitude that Dr. King cultivated. And the tutors of the nonviolent movement cultivated in the culture of those who are on the front lines of that cause, a sense that the most rabid racist that you might encounter is much less the devil himself and much more somebody who's caught a disease, if you will, right? And so they themselves are ultimately suffering at a deeper level on account of having to carry that affliction around with them. And so really, the nonviolent movement was a work of liberation, not just for the people for whom it was advocating equal rights, but in a missionary sort of manner towards trying to release people from a spirit of contempt and hatred that they themselves were victimized by. And so if you can locate your righteous anger in a way that is justifiably outraged about injustice in society and the forces and systems that perpetuate that, without equating that to your uncle, to your neighbor, to your grandmother, or your grandfather, then you will be able to summon the energy of that righteous anger in a righteous way. And that is the capacity that we must learn to command.
Well, I wanted to thank you again for coming here. People like you give me hope, so I really appreciate this.
Thank you very much.
Now that said, I think I think it takes two to tango.
Yeah.
So if I'm really putting my heart into a conversation with somebody, really keeping it open, and they're still coming at me with the knives, what's this dynamic look like? Can compassion really be contagious enough that it can make an impact? We're just individuals here.
But we're not just individuals, you know? Though I take your point, of course. I do think that in the movement that we are nurturing at Braver Angels and elsewhere, as modest as it is at the moment, I do think it is possible for us to collectively organize and develop strategies to be able to deepen the commitment and to plant the seeds of commitment to these norms and values in our institutions and to challenge the predominant narratives in American society in a way that moves us towards this way of being. But to just take it to the individual level for a moment, I think that the thing to accept is that this is patient work. It's not usually the case that you will take somebody, especially if they are deeply steeped in contempt, whether left or right, doesn't matter, and transform their worldview and their entire sort of emotional disposition in the space of a single conversation. Everybody's different. Every situation is different, right? But it is less a commitment to a temporary tactic and more a commitment to an ongoing way of being, right? But over time, change does occur. And the very fact that we're all still here having this conversation in this incredibly fractious society is some testament to the reality of that. George Wallace, Jim Crow governor, Alabama, right, was perhaps the most visible racist in America, you could argue. Certainly the most adamantly proud of that, and a man who ran for president and was a very prominent politician. As he lay dying in the hospital, found himself ministered to by Shirley Chisholm, the first, I believe Shirley was the first black woman to run for president, and a prominent voice for social justice in the Democratic Party, who sought out Wallace and had conversations with him in his waning days. And Wallace came to a point of repentance. He came to the point of apologizing for the views that he had held, right? So we all exist on a spectrum, right? And again, this is why I say, I try not to speak in terms of 100% solutions in any easily definable period of time. But we can move the needle with every step forward we take in moving ourselves more deeply into a more agapic way of being, I would say. And so, but the value you derive from that has to be even more rooted in the internal experience of developing that spiritual and moral strength than it is in just realizing the external outcome. Yes, you have to seek the external outcome, but the thing that'll sustain you in walking that walk is just growing as the kind of person who is rooted in righteous love, right? And that becomes an intrinsic reward all of its own. So that's what I would say.
I'll try to pass on your wisdom and pass on some hope. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely talk.
Thank you.
It seems that our sort of modern age is characterized by a lot of mis and disinformation. So the example that you gave about abortion, there are ethical and moral disagreements that we can have.
Yeah.
How do we bridge the divide on something a bit more objectively real, something like the outcome of an election or the efficacy of a vaccine?
Right.
How do we actually find middle ground with people who are seemingly not engaging in the same objective reality we are?
Right. I mean, it does ultimately come back to the trust question. Now, there are different levels of this because you can be talking systematically or we can be talking on sort of the individual level. And maybe you're thinking in terms of all of that. I would say that the broad answer, universally speaking, is that we are not going to listen to one another. We're not going to listen to sources of information that are contrary to our biases until we at least come to the point of trusting the intention of the sources of information, right? And so this is why this is a relational project fundamentally. On the subject, though, of the vaccine in particular, I don't mind speaking publicly about this because I've had public conversations about this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the podcaster and neuroscientist Sam Harris or the biologist Brett Weinstein. They had a famous friendship in sort of podcast intellectual circles, conversations with Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and so forth, where they agreed on many things, but ultimately Weinstein was somebody who became deeply, a friend of mine, I should say, Brett, became deeply opposed to the mRNA vaccine, believing that it was causing myocarditis and it was ultimately harmful to the health of Americans, and made arguments to that effect. And Sam believed that what Brett was doing was spreading misinformation that was potentially contributing to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, right? The reason I mentioned the two of them is because they stopped being friends largely on the basis of that issue. They stopped speaking to each other. And I understand why Sam made that decision, because he did not want to endorse or validate or platform somebody who was spreading dangerous information. But the argument I tried to make to Sam, and you can look up a podcast conversation of me, having a long conversation with Sam on the subject, is that once Sam and Brett stopped speaking to each other, their hundreds of thousands of followers who once followed each of them anytime they would have a conversation stopped following the other one, the one on the other side, which meant that you had hundreds of thousands of Americans who no longer were in conversation with each other, but crucially, were no longer opening even one of their ears towards a source of information that may be contrary to their biases, but that they would have trusted the intention of. Because most of Brett's fans might have disagreed with Sam on any number of things, but their general opinion of Sam was, but this is a guy who's trying to be intellectually honest, so even if I doubt what he's saying, let me listen to him. And same thing going the other direction. So as soon as Brett and Sam stopped speaking, that portal was closed. And it helped solidify us in a landscape, in an informational landscape, where suddenly we are not hearing each other, because again, we are not trusting the moral intention of anybody who disagrees with us. And so I suppose the point that I'm making here is that there's an individual manifestation of the trust issue, but then there's a manifestation of the trust issue which exists on the level of big independent and mainstream media, right? And ultimately, the thing that makes it so sticky is that you would like to think we could just have an objective conversation about the science, but with the trust impasse, people don't show up to that conversation. They don't listen to that conversation. And that lack of trust is itself tied to a long string of political and cultural and social traumas, experiences, and vendettas that have actually nothing to do, ultimately, nothing directly to do with the issue that we're divided on, right? The distrust in government is something that way precedes the distrust in the vaccine, but indirectly, the connection is there. And so there's a whole cultural shift that needs to take place before we can address the information silo problem. So that's how I would analyze that.
Thank you.
Thank you. These are good questions.
Hi.
Hi.
I love this whole idea. It's what I try to teach my elementary and middle school kids every day, and how they approach each other.
Good for you.
And
Yeah.
I heard you say that we can hold our political leaders accountable to loving discourse. And pre-2016, I'd be like, yeah, we can do that. But I really, how? When we have someone in power who can't even be held to the law
Yeah.
in their actions, and who uses the most dehumanizing language I've heard from a political leader in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And not only that, but was restored to power while using that discourse.
Right.
I feel really powerless as a collective, as individuals, to influence the discourse of leaders in this direction,
Right.
when this continues with no end in sight, no recourse in sight. So how do we do that is my question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, there are levels to all of this. You are doing the most important work you could be doing as an individual, which is educating and morally edifying, virtuously edifying our students, right? So you're playing this powerful, formative role in the people who are ultimately going to inherit the mess that hopefully we don't leave them as messy as it looks right now, right? The project of holding our leaders accountable, of course, exists on different levels too. We exist here as not just, citizens of the United States of America subject to a president of the United States, but to members of our city council, our state legislators, our members of Congress, right? And so there's an expression of this project that exists across the spectrum of political leadership in American society. You don't want to start with Donald Trump as one individual. And yet, whether it's Donald Trump or any politician you want to name on the left, if we can begin to build a cultural movement in American society that exists according to this standard and that builds out a powerful political coalition that exists not first and foremost as a political coalition, but as a cultural coalition that embraces Americans who are divided on questions of political outcomes, but united on the sort of culture that they want to see, then our political leaders will have to respond to the existence of that powerful moral community at every level of our democratic society, including President Trump. And so I think that this becomes a collective question, right? And it's the thing that, we've been working on, I would argue, at Braver Angels and elsewhere in this larger depolarization universe, but building out the structures and the pathways towards organizing the American people towards a culture of goodwill that transcends the divide, that then exerts a meaningful influence on the major parties and on our political leaders. That's the work that needs to be done. And as a matter of fact, I really would encourage people to speak to my friends and colleagues here if you have questions about the work of Braver Angels, Mary Beth Stibbons, Elizabeth Dahl, incredible leaders right here in Seattle, Marissa Gaston, of course, Monica Guzman is an extraordinary leader just in our culture. There are people who are striving to do this work. And it's difficult because the business model of the political parties and of the partisan media are rooted in conflict and dehumanization as the very strategy by which they gain ratings and votes. So breaking through the dynamics of that environment structurally requires a great deal of innovation and moral commitment and patience. But we have built out an infrastructure that extends with thousands of Americans volunteering across the country. Local chapters in across the United States of America work on college campuses across the country, programs at every level of government, including the United States Congress, state houses, municipalities. And there are resources and innovators that are coming into this space who stand, I think, in a position to be able to scale up the impact of this as we move forward into this next chapter of American political history. But it doesn't work unless we are able to tap into the history that we have behind us, a history of moral triumph in the face of what seemed like insurmountable odds. Because you have to remember, the civil rights movement broke through on questions of law and conscience after 100 years of oppression and dehumanization following the end of slavery, right? And so you think there wasn't a lot of patience leading up to that. I think that the status quo as it exists today will not be the status quo always. And I don't just mean that in terms of the individuals occupying office, but the corrosive soil that they stand in, that the politics of demagoguery grow out of. If we can cleanse the soil, so to speak, in the moral fiber of our culture, then what grows from it is going to be something much better than what we have today. So we just have to get started. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
John.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you for coming out tonight, spending time in cold, dark Seattle from LA.
I enjoyed it. I was
so
sick of all that sunshine in Los Angeles. No,
We're going to put our hands together to thank John Wood Jr. Thank you.
thank you very much. Thank you.